The summer of 1965, I was at Miles College in Birmingham, Alabama, a small black school. I was there under the auspices of something called the Southern Teaching Program, which operated out of Yale University. And the way the program worked was it would put graduate students primarily from northern institutions into these small predominantly black colleges in the South in the summer, and at the same time they would provide funding for the regular faculty at the schools to advance their education. So it was seen as a way of helping out with the isolation which many of these small black campuses experienced in the Old South. Around 10 o'clock on the morning of July the 19th, 1965, I was sitting in the library. I was reading to pass the time until my first class at 11. A friend came in and told me that a Mrs. Clark, a black lady, rather elderly lady who was a student at the college, told me that her husband was being held at the jail in Midfield until she could come down to the police station. Mrs. Clark herself was outside, and she explained to me that about a year ago her husband had suffered a stroke, which impaired his memory, and that he had been picked up by the police that morning for driving without a driver's license. She was notified at the college and felt sure that he had his license somewhere on his person, but simply was unable to find it. So I offered to give her the needed ride down to the police station in Midfield. It was only about 2 miles away from the college, so that she could obtain his release. Mr. Clark had found his license by the time we arrived. He found his license while we were on our way to the station, and so he was allowed to leave. My only remaining chore once we got there was to drive the two of them the few blocks to their car from the police station, which their car was parked beside the road at the place where Mr. Clark had been arrested in the first place. The arrest had occurred on a rural road at the scene of a driver's license checkpoint, which had been put up by the Midfield Police Department. And to get Mr. and Mrs. Clark to their car, I had to drive through the checkpoint myself. When I did that, the policeman who had arrested Mr. Clark only an hour or two before glared into the back seat and saw Mr. Clark sitting there in the back seat of my car. Said, "Is that the Reverend again?" Mr. Clark was a retired minister. The officer asked to see my driver's license, and he looked at it and he said, which of course was a North Carolina driver's license. He looked at it. He said, "What are you doing in Alabama?" I said, "I'm an instructor at Miles College." He said to me, "How long have you been in Alabama?" I said, "About a month." And he said to me, "You're under arrest." Now, this gave me a good bit of a jolt, but of course, such things at that time were not totally unexpected in Alabama. He went on to say, you have to obtain an Alabama driver's license within 30 days of the time you enter the state. Well, I tried to get in another word, but he reminded me then that I was under arrest and said, would I please get my car off the road and get into the back seat of the police car. I parked, and then I asked if I might speak to the arresting officer for a moment. But once again, he said I was under arrest and was ordered to get into the car. In the meantime, I'd done a little mental calculation, and I figured that I had actually been employed in Alabama for exactly 4 weeks, 4 weeks to the day. It was a Monday. And I finally managed to so inform the arresting officer. But his reply made me realize that any further attempt at communication was pretty useless, because what he said was, in Alabama, 4 weeks is considered 30 days. after he said that, I think he decided it didn't really make any sense, because then he declared that anyone who is employed in Alabama has to obtain an Alabama driver's license immediately. So in any case, I was then driven off to the police station to be booked on charges of driving in Alabama without an Alabama driver's license. When I got to the police station, the usual data was requested: name, age, date of birth, etc. For my home address, I gave Salisbury, North Carolina, at which time the desk officer entered Salsberry on the police record. I was informed that I'd have to post $35 cash bond, and I was given an opportunity to call someone to bring the money. So after making that call, I was led to the prison area, frisked for weapons, asked if I was carrying a pocket knife, and locked up in a cell. And in about 40 minutes, Dean Jones, the dean of Miles College, and Carl Smith of the business office arrived at the police station with the cash bond to obtain my release. When they arrived, the police officer sitting at the desk said, "Hey, some boy's here to pick up that guy." Of course, Dean Jones was probably in his 50s at the time. So I was told to appear 2 days later for my trial. Now, of course, when Dean Jones and Mr. Smith picked me up, we were still left with the problem of getting my car, which turned out to be no small matter, because at the time of my arrest, I had noticed that the only people nearby, near the driver's license checkpoint, besides the police, were workers from a small factory just off the road who were operating a picket line of some sort as part of a strike. And they had jeered at me and sort of snickered at the time of my arrest. They were an all-white crowd. Apparently the factory they were working at was not integrated at the time, and they had, of course, seen that I was being arrested for being with black people. I didn't want to bring Jones and Smith into a confrontation with either the police at the license checkpoint or with the pickets. So I recommended to them that they just drop me off and that I walk to my car, with them sort of sitting in the background in their car. But by the time I actually got there, the police at the checkpoint had disappeared, and the only thing left was the picket line. When I entered the parking lot to get my car, one of the pickets, all of whom were standing or sitting under a shade tree by the side of the road at that time, one of the pickets shouted that I was crossing the picket line. I didn't see a picket line actually in operation then. And he demanded that I show some respect for their strike. After assuring him that they had my sympathy, I was allowed to proceed, but most of the pickets were now on their feet and rather glowering in my direction. So I didn't feel very comfortable in that situation. I noticed then that I was standing right in the path of a tow truck, which was in the process of hauling my car out of the parking lot. It had been sitting there about an hour and 10 minutes and was in absolutely no one's way. But the tow truck was there. It was hooked to my car. The lot, in fact, was almost empty, except for my car and the workers who were on strike. The driver in the truck explained that he had orders to tow the car in. I said that it was my car that he was pulling, and I was glad to see that he was black. I figured that was perhaps my best stroke of luck that had happened so far that day. So I just told him I was going to hop in and ride with him, and I did that. I jumped up in the truck with him, and we drove out of that parking lot, pulling my perfectly good car along behind with the rather angry pickets just sort of glaring at us as we went past. The driver of the tow truck stopped by the police station to allow me to go in and see what could be done about me regaining my car. The officer at the desk explained he knew nothing about the matter and that the hauling must have been ordered by the arresting officer. I told him that I'd arrived at the lot before my car was towed away, but the desk man explained that the tow truck had already been called and the operation could not be stopped. So I was told I'd have to pay a $7.50 tow charge. And I was also told that I couldn't get the release of my car until it arrived at the garage where it was being towed to, which of course was the destination of the tow truck. So I finished my ride all the way across town in the tow truck with my perfectly good car being pulled along behind. During the 2 days between that incident and my trial, a fellow from Texas who was there at the college as part of an NSF summer program for high school teachers helped me do some research. He was a white guy from Texas with a very heavy southern drawl. He had played on the University of Texas football team in whatever bowl game it was where Texas had played North Carolina back when Charlie Justice was playing for North Carolina. But anyway, we had him call the Alabama State Troopers and the Birmingham City Police Department and also the State Department of Motor Vehicles to find out what kind of law there is on the books with regard to requiring you to have an Alabama driver's license once you go into the state. And the best we could learn from these 3 agencies was that there is no 30-day limitation. The only thing there is a 90-day limitation, and that is only if you're in the process of becoming a permanent resident. So I felt pretty confident when I went back to my trial because there didn't seem to be any such law as the one I had been arrested under. The day of my trial, I had someone drive me to the trial. I sat down in the courtroom, and the judge held my case for last. I think he knew that there was a bit of a problem associated with my case. So I watched the proceedings that day. Most everything that was going on was traffic cases. All the white defendants that were called up were addressed by their last name. All the black defendants were addressed by their first names. But it didn't matter. Everybody was convicted in any case. I think during the whole day, up until the time I was called up, there hadn't been a single acquittal. It was guilty as charged. But so anyway, when I was called up, the judge asked me if I had anything to say. And I said, well, I have contacted the Birmingham City Police and the Alabama State Troopers and the State Department of Motor Vehicles. And according to these agencies, there is no 30-day limitation for having an Alabama driver's license. But even if there is a law that says you have to have one within 30 days, I didn't break it because I had only been in the state for 4 weeks at the time that I was arrested. So the judge looked at me and said, it's not up to these agencies, that is the police and the state troopers and the Department of Motor Vehicles, it's not up to these agencies to determine the laws of Alabama. This court determines the law. But he said, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and let you off this time, but you should try to set a better example. Well, I didn't know exactly what that meant, but in any case, I was glad to be acquitted. So he found me not guilty. And as soon as I started to leave the courtroom that day, the same officer that had arrested me at the checkpoint came up to me as I was leaving the courtroom and asked me if I drove to my trial. And it was absolutely clear if I had, he was going to arrest me again. But by that time, I had figured how these guys work. So I told him, no, I didn't drive to my trial. So I got my bail money returned to me and got out of there as quickly as I could. And I kept a pretty low profile as far as driving was concerned for the rest of that summer until I left Alabama. And I have a very strong memory of when that summer did end and I got in my car and headed for the Georgia state line. When I saw that state line ahead of me through my windshield, I felt like entering the state of Georgia was entering the land of the free. One thing I did come away from that summer, though, was a better understanding of why dialogue can be very difficult when people have very differing views of reality. I was pretty ticked off by that experience I had been through. So I wrote some letters. I wrote to the two Birmingham newspapers, wrote letters to the editor, and I wrote to the Alabama Attorney General's office. The Attorney General at that time was Richmond Flowers, who had a rather liberal image on the national scene. But neither of the two newspapers or the Attorney General's office even responded to my letter. So I'd failed in my attempts to publicize the event at all. When I came back to the college that day, the day of the arrest, after having been bailed out of jail, of course I was late getting to my class by that time, but my college students, the black students there at Miles, reacted with a great deal of amusement because, of course, they're familiar with incidents like this happening all the time to them. To them, it was rather amusing to see it happening to a white person, but the incident fit in quite naturally with their perception of the reality of the local environment. This was during a period in which Birmingham had lots of unsolved bombings, and the police were presumed to be involved with many of them. The police department had over 500 members, of whom only 2 were black at that time. And in fact, the college had a high fence all the way around it, the campus did, with an armed guard who manned the fence at night, and the presumed purpose was primarily to keep the police away. So it was a period of high tension that this all occurred in. But what demonstrated to me the difference in perception of reality between the black community and the white community was something that occurred not too long after that. We were visited one day on campus by some white students who were home for the summer. They were college students who during the year had been away from home at their college. But when they were home for the summer, they learned that there were some white graduate students teaching at Miles College from out of state. And as a friendly gesture, they had come by to meet with us and talk with us. And I interpreted that as a very liberal gesture on their part. They probably represented some of the more liberal white families in the area of Birmingham. But when I related this incident to them, I could tell that they were somewhat skeptical because the story I was telling them of what had happened to me did not fit in with their perception of the reality of their community. They simply were not used to hearing this kind of story. So there was enough of a difference between the black community in Birmingham at that time and even the more liberal segments of the white community that it was hard to have a dialogue about this sort of thing because the perceptions of reality were so different.